And if you're on videos, sorry, Patreon. Okay.
Thank you both for doing the thing.
Thank you for everything, actually. It's, I've been attending some of the panels. This one looks packed.
Okay, so shall we start?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you all for attending this session. 1,001 years later, what happened with Arabian fiction? With me here is Shayma Alshareef. Introduce yourself and then also.
Hi, thank you all for coming. My name is Shayma Alshareef.
Mike closer.
Is that better?
Yes, much better.
I'm a physician by profession and a writer by night. So I get to be a nurse in the morning. I'm very divided. I have 2 novels. Both were bestsellers in the Arab world, both in my country and in other countries. I've been one of my novels. This one was is adapted to be a series on one of the video on demand applications. View. They have about 7 million subscribers. I also was the ambassador of Arab Thought Foundation for 3 years. And I love writing. Basically, that's what it is. Basically, I love fiction, and that's what I'm writing about. Of course, I have to write some stuff about medicine, which I find very inspiring. And that's what I do.
So, I am Yasser Bahjatt. I am an engineer by trade. I work in technology at Future Technologies. I founded Yatakhayaloon, which is a publishing company. The name means they are imagining. It's a company specialized in Arabian fiction. And the company was founded because of our belief that you need fiction to grow technology in any part of the world. So to help grow technology in our part of the world, we thought to try to jumpstart Arabian fiction in that part of the world. I have published through my publishing company 1 bestseller titled Yatakhayaloon, and I co-authored the English copy of 3 of our other bestsellers that were originally written by my partner, Ibrahim Abbas. All of our books, both me, Ibrahim, and Shayma, are on Kindle for free during the con. So you can just go onto our Amazon page. I have cards here that will take you there if you need help with that. And so I think we're going to start off. The structure is going to be more about Arabian fiction, past, present, and future. And I think we can start off with the past. Like the most famous Arabian fiction is clearly from our title, 1001 Nights. And I think that was, to a huge extent, a sort of like the last very well-known Arabian fiction piece of work. And then we kind of fell off the map. That's why the 1001 years. So, Shayma, start off with you.
Okay. Actually, Yasser and Ibrahim, they had the same lecture 1 year ago in Finland. And there was one of the questions about where are the female analogists. So here I am. And it's actually interesting that the subject is 1001 nights or 1001 later, because if we look back at 1001 nights, Actually, the main character, she was a female. Any one of you read that?
Yes.
So for those who didn't, she was a female. Her name is Shahrazad. She married a king, and that king used to kill every wife. He marries a new wife every night, and then he kills her. And that because his first wife cheated on him. So Shahrazad, when she married him, she decided that okay, I'm gonna tell him a story every night to stay alive, basically. And in the middle of the night, she tells him, you know what? We're gonna continue the story tomorrow. And it is a very interesting story to read because it's like a story in another story, and that keeps on going for 1001 nights. At the end, he doesn't know quite well, so we get to know. And the other thing that is really interesting about 1001 Nights is that it has stories from all over the world. And if we're thinking about a story that was written at that time, I would be fascinated about the one or about the person who wrote it, because at that time we did not have that kind of transportation that we have today. Yet these stories were rich, were from all over the world, and they were really cultural. There was a cultural awareness in these pictures, so in these stories. So it's not a person who travels for a short period of time, and that's why some of the historians they say that it cannot be written by one person. It has to be written by so many writers who came together to write 1001 Nights. Of course,
Actually, a lot of historians kind of agree that 1001 Nights is almost the first anthology ever. That all of these stories were from so many different story writers or story creators, and this one person kind of took all of this and wrote a story on top of that of how he was able to link all of them together through the story of Shahrazad. But that's one of the very interesting things about, like 1001 Nights has a lot of firsts inside that piece of work that we still use a lot of its stuff till today. So thank you all on that.
no, no. Actually, one announcement before we continue. A lot of you here were asking me about the names of the book, how they can find the names of the books that we're going to mention. So at the end of the lecture, we're going to be tweeting about the names of the books that we're going to be talking about.
Books,
For
authors.
those authors.
And authors, like we're gonna mention a lot of maybe Arabian authors that some of you have never heard of, or so we're gonna try to mention all of them on our Twitter feed, so that they don't get lost in translation or spelling or whatever.
And continue to that. After that, we had in our history and in our culture, storytelling was kind of the thing that brings people together. We had storytellers that they usually be in mosques, after the prayer, and then they tell people about all of the fantasies that we had, and we're talking about 1,000 years back, where they just gather people, and I'm not talking children, I'm talking 30 and above. Okay, and they tell them all kind of stories, and like there are some funny stories about the storytellers themselves. Like one of the guys who were listening to the storytellers, and then the storyteller got tired, and he told him that he's going home. So he followed him home and waited for him until he wakes up the next morning. Like, okay, now you're awake. What's happening? And it's really sad what happened after that, when we had lack of fiction in the era afterward.
So, like, before we move on to what happened next is I want to go through a few like firsts in 1001 Nights, and that we all see till today. Like a lot of fiction and Hollywood movies and all this stuff pick up a lot of the ideas out of 1001. So the idea, for example, of the kind of cute thief or cute rebel, like Han Solo, for example, it comes from Ali Baba in 1001 Nights. The first ever detective / police kind of stories came out of 1001. The idea of this hero that goes and tries to save the princess, again, comes out of the 1001 Nights. And you can see a lot of these themes that have been used over and over again in so many different pieces of fiction after that. And if you dig, the more you dig into 1001 Nights, the more you see that there really isn't much fiction created outside the boundaries that 1001 Nights had set in the first place. But then something happened, and suddenly there was no more fiction or imaginative work coming out of that part of the world, the Middle East, Arabia, and the Islamic world in general. And so that is kind of a question mark. What happened? And if we take my theory that science fiction and imagination is a more important aspect than science itself, so you see that almost at the same time, scientific development across the Arabian world started declining, save for Andalusia, but because it was somewhat cut off from the rest of the Islamic world, a lot of their fiction work, which did exist, but never became as popular as the rest of them. So, looking at that, what were the reasonings and stuff like this? One thought is that the conservatives started demanding that people start imagining and thinking for themselves and just following whatever they preached and whatever they thought the meaning of text would be. And that obviously had a lot of ramifications that crossed too many boundaries, specifically very clearly in storytelling.
Exactly, and if you even follow the Islamic art, you will find the decline as well in the same period of time, which is interesting because science, fiction writing, and art, they all depend on imagining. So if you stop imagining because of certain religious direction, then of course you will got all of that. I guess that happened and nobody paid attention to it, and there was like a very, very huge time gap, almost 1,000 years. Like we can't, I guess when we were discussing, me and Yasser, like when exactly did that happen? We will think around Dawla al-Abbasiyya, what we call that were in Baghdad, around the same time. It was almost 750 to 1570 AD. After that, you can actually go and look for fiction writing and you will not find a lot. And even those were outliers and people did not accept them. Actually, they were somehow rejected by people very aggressively.
Of course, not all of those declines were directly linked to fundamentalists or another part would be the disasters that happened through the Mongol invasion and the loss of the Library of Baghdad because of that. Like the Niles in Baghdad the water turned into black because of all the books that the Mongols threw into the river. So, of course, losing such a huge reservoir of knowledge, and almost overnight, kind of destroys whatever culture and people start, well, it's not important for us right now to imagine, it's more important for us to survive and to figure out what to do next. And I guess all of these things combined kind of created that stagnation. But with time, obviously a few centuries of time, things kind of started to reverse. It only kind of started to reverse maybe at the end of last century, and we started having some very strong popular authors, but not in fiction, like Abbas, Ahqad, some other. So now storytelling started to come back, but not as fiction, more in social storytelling. But at least storytelling started to come back. Like before that, the whole idea of you wouldn't find a lot of books published by people who respected themselves or were respected by the culture that would just publish stories. They would publish science or religious texts or whatever. But the idea of storytelling coming back was sometime like in the beginning of the last century, mid-last century. Then end of last century, we started to find fiction most prominently by an author called Nabil Fadl, who I personally consider to be like the godfather of contemporary Arabian fiction. Nabil Fadl. Yeah. So he published his most, he has two very famous series of fiction. One is Malaf al-Mustaqbal, which technically translates the future files. And the second one is Rajul Mustahil, or the man of the impossible, or something like that. The first one is science fiction. The second one is more like a spy, so it's like the 007 of Egypt. But a lot, so I'm saying it's 007 of Egypt, and the other one is more like Star Trek of Egypt. So it was more like, it was more Western kind of content, but written in Arabian form, so that it had a little bit of Arabian culture, not a lot, but it got my generation interested and involved in this kind of material, so that the next generation would start producing our own rather than just trying to localize it. And I think one of his most famous sort of apprentices would be Ahmed Khalid Tawfiq, who I think died this year or last year.
Yeah, last year.
So he passed away last year, but he has a lot of very interesting science fiction and fiction written in Arabic and translated to English. Nabil Fadl, unfortunately, I haven't seen any translations for his work. There's a seat right up here.
It's just a 20 years later.
Well, I would have said that to any audience. But,
all these other people standing. Like you have a big crowd.
thank you. So,
Actually, if we summarize that era of writing, history was the most dominant type of writing at that time. You know, like we lost a lot of history at that time, so you know everyone was trying to document history at that time. And then when storytelling re-emerged, I would say Nabil Fadl was the godfather of fiction in the new era. Ahmed Khalid Tawfiq was his student. But I love Ahmed Khalid Tawfiq because he had that amazing sense of humor. You know, he can take the most tragic thing you can ever think of and make you laugh. And that's actually sad. That's like a very dark sarcasm. And then I would think of also Najib Mahfouz. If you heard of him, he got the Nobel Prize for he had a trilogy and he got the Nobel Prize for that. And it's a very interesting. Again, I'm always going to go back and forth talking about where female fall in all of that, because even when the storytelling re-emerged, the female was one of two has one of two roles. She was either a victim of some social or cultural values that were opposed, or she was a lover, and she was that beautiful body and certain physical characters, which for me now as a writer and as a reader, that was really unfair, because I'm a full human being. I can have different roles than being a victim and being in love, and that's exactly what I did in my second novel, where I chose the evil person to be a woman, because guess what? I guess nobody can evil more than us. And that worked very well, honestly.
equal opportunity. So, after Nabil Fadl started writing his stuff and a lot of us started consuming it, now the new generation were ready to start producing our own stuff. Nabil Fadl kind of gave us the base for us to be able to launch from and really explore our potential. And there are, today there's a lot of very strong, prominent, if I talked to you 5 years ago, I would not have told you that science fiction or fantasy has any real strong presence in that area. Even Nabil Fadl was never really identified as science fiction author. He just kind of wrote what he did, and he never really titled it. So now we're kind of trying to have a movement where we really have a title on it, educate people about it. And now we have, so within the past 5 years, almost all best-selling novels across Arabia are science fiction or fantasy. So, and not best, like in Arabia, they don't do best-selling novels, they do best-selling books. So you'd always find the best-selling books across Arabia, okay, would be always fantasy or science fiction. When my partner launched his first novel, Haujan, it was the same month Dan Brown's novel Inferno was launched in Arabic, and Haujan was #1 and then Dan Brown was #2. It was like first shot, and that's what we did. It was amazing, but it showed that how our youth were really thirsty and hungry for local content in the fiction arena. And from that point on, like when we tried to publish our first novel, no publisher in Arabia would publish science fiction or fantasy, so we had to start up our own publishing company. But the next year, suddenly publishers were just picking up science fiction novels right front and center. There's Mundar Qabbani, he actually published before we did. He has a trilogy, and he's a bestseller. We have Osama al-Muslim, who so far, he published like a year after us, but so far he's published, I think, like 8 different books, and all of his books are bestsellers. And it's becoming a trend that it's now becoming trendy to write science fiction, although that was not the case 5 years ago. And this just shows how much the youth they enjoyed Western or Japanese fiction, but now they really love to see content from their own cultures. Again, Shayma Alshareef with the 2 books, which also not only spoken to the local youth, but also inspired a lot of females to, first of all, read fiction and to try and explore writing it as well. I think you said there was a few female, unfortunately, I'm not really familiar with a lot of the female writers today, so.
Actually, when we talk about fiction and the production of fiction and females, I would say until now we lack that in the Arab world. But again, that's the case all over the world. J.K. Rowling, when she first published her books, they were under an alias, and now people are. After I've published my books, I'm getting emails and messages almost every week from females who are working to publish their own books. And thanks to your work, guys, we are inspired to work, or actually to make your work kind of fit our culture. Of course, there will be a lot of changes, but we are thirsty for more work. We are thirsty for good things. And believe it or not, I would say in Arab world, females are really, really, really bad critics in your case for writers, but they are good critics when it comes to judging books. Because remember, we are a conservative culture. So basically females, they have a lot of time to read. And now that we are open to the rest of the world, okay, now we have that amount of knowledge and they can critique anything. And if you explore social media, you will find a lot of female critiques.
Like most of our critiques of our books, like 70-80% of the reviews we get on our books are females, okay, rather than the guys. So, and a lot of them really like hone their skill of critiquing. It's not like just somebody who just put in a couple of words, I didn't like it. No, you really see a lot of very interesting and detailed critiques, to the extent that sometimes even when they're critiquing my book and they're attacking it, I'm actually enjoying reading that.
And they actually have a lot of followers. So when one of the famous critics say something good or compliment about your book, you will find the next day the publishing house or the library we have, Jadid, which is the biggest bookstore we have there, is like, they're like, what's happening? What's happening? And it's vice versa. When they attack your book, you will find their followers attacking you as well. So be careful. And for me as a female, that makes me so happy, because now we are having critiques. We have potential writers, and even readers. Now we are having so many competitions, reading competitions, writing competitions. I've been in the judging panels for some of them. And trust me, when I read the work and they ask about the age of the writer, you would be really surprised, because remember, the older ones, they are already did not have enough exposure to good fiction, but the younger ones, they are dangerous. So yeah, I guess within the next 5 years or within the next 10 years, you will find, I guess we will have so many very international fiction books from all over the Arab world, and even the countries that were kind of shy to publish, they are now having many more publishing houses, and there are now publishing houses who are specializing in fiction and fantasy and sci-fi, and that's amazing.
One of the challenges we are currently facing with Arabian fiction is, unlike most fiction across the world, is it's right now hard to find a way to properly translate them into other languages, because the industry of translating a fiction from Arabic to English or to any other language has never existed. I mean, the industry of writing fiction in Arabic in the first place hasn't existed properly except for the past 5 or 6 years. So now finding people who have the proper skills and interest to translate this work into English, as to be able to expose all of these writers to the rest of the world, is kind of an emerging piece of industry. And that's why so far there isn't really much Arabian, although you'll find a lot of Arabian fiction being produced in Arabic, you'll find very few fiction work that are being translated to English. And that's why one of the things that we have in our publishing company, is one of our policies, is once we write any piece of fiction in Arabic, it has to be, the English copy of it should be published within maximum a year of publishing to Arabic, hopefully within the same time period. Like most of our novels have been published in English a couple of months after the Arabic publication, at least on Amazon. But the more work we get now, the more time it's going to take us, because we still don't have the proper team to be able to do that. And we're trying to work out with several organizations to get that running. However, a lot of the book competition, or like we have the Boker competition, which is almost like, I wouldn't say it's like the Nebula, but it's an Arabian fiction kind of award, and if somebody wins that award, they automatically translate his work to English. So one of the prominent science fiction authors wrote Frankenstein in Baghdad. He's an Iraqi writer, and you can find that novel. I can't remember the author's name, but the novel itself, you can find it in English because that organization translated it.
What was the title?
Frankenstein in Baghdad.
Frankenstein in Baghdad.
Do you remember the author's name?
Ahmed Sadi?
Sadawi, yes.
And remember, again, there were certain countries, like we had a lot of work coming from Egypt, Lebanon, but almost nothing from the Gulf. Almost. But now we are having that, and I guess by reaching out and by translating, and not just translating, I guess translating, adapting it to series, even now thinking comics, I guess we're reaching out to the rest of the world. And that again, that fascinates me, and that makes me go back again to 1001 Nights. That's exactly what that story did, is that we kind of communicated with the whole world. You know, we did not just exchange cultures, we exchanged much more than that. And that's exactly what we're trying to do now. But remember, in order to do that, we had, as fictional writers, to kind of come together and join forces, because we're still kind of new in the market, although we are facing the audience hunger. Now that we started to write, we have messages coming almost every day. When is the next novel? When is the next appearance? Whenever I write that I'm doing something, or I'm traveling, or I'm having a vacation, are you reading a new novel? And that's amazing. It's like, I want to have so many writers because this is what we need. And I want to have more work translated from Arabic to English, from English to Arabic, from Spanish to Arabic, and vice versa. And this is how we as writers grow.
And in our company, although we don't have the current capacity financially and by our team to publish a lot of published novels from so many other authors, but we're helping a lot of authors, like a lot of the authors that are now prominent, we kind of help them and pointed them to other publishers to grow. And again, part of it is because of our message that we want to grow the fiction, the science fiction and the fiction culture in Arabia, regardless of who gets the financial benefits, but at the same time, so that we get less load on our shoulders, and nobody keeps bugging us. You can go back there when his next novel is, or hopefully when there's 100 other authors. Okay, people are not. We're going to be distributing this bugging amongst all of us, rather than just 2 or 3 of us. And another thing of why I think this is an important thing about Arabian fiction, I think it's not just Arabian fiction. To me, I look at science fiction and fantasy. It's more like, as I said, it shows the way forward for all technological and development for humanity. And the way I see it is as if humanity is in this huge empty desert and it's dark, there is no moon, and suddenly somebody realizes he has a flashlight. And if he turns it on and points towards the direction, where do you think everybody else is going to be going? That the path he light with his flashlight might not be the optimum or the best, but nobody's going to go in the other direction. Now, whenever any new culture turns on their flashlight, they just show humanity a new possible path. And the more flashlights, the more cultures that turn on their fiction and their spotlights, okay, the more possibility humanity has to grow and to expand. And I think that's why it's important not just for Arabian fiction to be an important aspect. I think that every culture has to start, we have to support all of these cultures to start building their own science fiction and their own fantasy, because that doesn't only help their culture, and it helps all of us really find out that there are so many other possibilities right now for technological and social growth than what we currently know about.
And plus in fiction we can discuss topics and problems that we normally cannot, or we have problems, or like we can talk about even global problems. We can talk about overpopulation, about GMOs, about diseases, wars. We can talk about things that usually are not so easy to talk about. We can open channels for communication. We can think of solutions that are out of the box, I would say. And the solutions we might give, because they're fictional, are not the solutions that we're going to follow at the end of the day, but they will inspire us to maybe find some new ways of our problems, to think of our problems.
And again, discussing the same problems by different cultures will make us have a better dialogue. Maybe the politicians are not going to be so easy about discussing these topics within the normal venues, but if science authors and science fiction authors start discussing these, each from their different point of view, of their cultural point of view, their social point of view, their economical point of view, there would be a much more interesting dialogue going on between those cultures and between those people than what's going on within closed rooms of politicians.
And remember, fiction gives voice to voiceless people. I would say that, because remember who, like, there are tables with politicians who talk, but again, there's the social aspect, okay, of us, of people who are living day to day, and fiction always give us that voice. I would say always fiction gives voice to the voiceless.
I think we can start opening up for questions now. Yeah. So.
Who's that lady?
Okay.
So, I came in late, so sorry if this question was answered, but you mentioned that there wasn't coming from the Gulf. So we see the Gulf, I'm thinking of like Yemen and countries like that. And I'm just wondering, basically, is part of it, it's just not coming out, or it's being censored? And then kind of a secondary question, like what about a place like Palestine, where people are rioting a lot and doing a lot of art.
So I think it was across the entire Gulf. It was the same thing, that there wasn't a lot of fiction coming out for all of the reasons we discussed of why fiction kind of dropped off the map across Arabia. But now we have fiction writers from Saudi. We have, I know, fiction writers, even female fiction writers from the UAE, from Kuwait, from Oman. Definitely, there's a lot of Palestinian fiction writers, like more than, like the majority of fiction writers, I would say, would be Egypt, and then it would be Palestinians. There's a lot of really good Palestinian fiction writers. So the whole area, the whole part of that of the world of Arabia, from Morocco all the way up to Iraq, fiction writers are starting to pop up. Like within the past year, I have participated in 3 different books about fiction that gather fiction writers from all across Arabia, either asking us to write articles about fiction or having it more like an anthology and having like short stories that are gathered from all of these Arabian writers from all of these countries where I have never heard of these authors myself as an adult, let alone you guys hearing about them outside. So I think that there's a lot that you can expect from Arabian fiction within the next 5 to 6 years, where there's a lot of very interesting and nice storylines coming out that are really different than what you would see from Western or Eastern fiction.
One of the writers, the Palestinian writers, I personally love and adore. Her name is May Ziada. You can look her up. She's very famous, and she almost translated her work to 7 different languages. So you might actually find it in English.
How to spell her name?
May Ziada. It's MAY ZEYADAAH.
Please, yeah.
I'm very curious, it's a very broad area, sci-fi and fantasy. Can you speak more about the subgenres, ones that we might be familiar to, or can you describe it?
Well, that's one thing where, I mean, if you look at fiction and fantasy all over the world, you kind of have a feel of what, like, the Japanese voice of science fiction and fantasy sounds like, right? And you can kind of know the voice of Japanese fantasy versus Japanese science fiction. And so they have kind of figured out what their voices are and how they're distinct from other voices across the planet. And I think that's one of the things we're still exploring in Arabia, is we're still trying to figure out who we are, what we stand for, how is our voice different from the rest of the world, and then maybe figure out what is the difference between fiction, science fiction and fantasy, and then maybe some subgenres. And I'm sure the subgenres we would have would end up, some of them would be identical to what we'd find outside, but some of them are going to be new. So right now we have subgenres that are kind of copying what's happening outside. Like my novel is an alternate history. My partner's first novel was more of a supernatural love story. Shayma's novels are more like medical, psychological medical fantasy. We have Osama Muslim, mainly what he writes is more like legend fiction, some kind of fiction based on legend and folk tales. But there's a lot of other voices that are coming up with our own subgenres that we're still exploring. And I think we'd have a much better answer for you maybe in a WorldCon 80 or so. Please, yeah.
Yes. Science fiction is the intersection between people and technology. Mm-hmm. And I've been doing a lot of research lately on Central Asia and the Middle East, and also the Swahili Reach. And one of the things I find is that they developed technologies that allowed large populations to thrive in very hellish landscapes. Mm-hmm. They had 2 collectors that collected 100 gallons of water a night, that sort of thing. Is there any Arabian science fiction developing that is, shall we say, Arabian technology and science, that sort of like Western science fiction but using Middle Eastern technology?
So in my novel, Yatakhayaloon, I kind of explore an alternate history, and within that I explore an alternate technological path that again would follow more our philosophy and our way of seeing things. It was more of a philosophical question. All the science we see today has been developed by sort of a culture or philosophy that's more materialistic and give value to material, to strength, to things that you can easily see and touch. And I wanted to explore how would technology develop differently had it been led by a more spiritual kind of approach, and people who had more emphasis on what's hidden than what's apparent. And we actually started the competition of $10,000 for anybody who can actually build some of these technologies that we came up with. I'm an engineer, so I believe that the concepts behind these technologies are valid and they could be done, but I don't have the power to make them happen. So hopefully someday somebody would actually make it happen and see where that goes. So.
Yeah, and remember, I guess the sci-fi would be different from what you guys know, because we rely heavily on history and culture. That's one thing. And the other thing is that we have...
And religious texts.
Yeah, and we have different needs. Remember, we live in a different environments. We have different kind of set of values, more or less, at the end of the day. And I guess that, like, remember, we live in desert. You guys have different set of environment. So I guess we will be inventing things that actually are related to us. Or actually, that's what we hope for, because at the end of the day, we want variety. I want to read something different from what I know. I want to read the Western books, and I want to see something different when I read something Arabic. I don't want a duplicate at the end of the day, and that's what we are here. But that's what we are hoping for. What we are encouraging people to do.
I just wondered if you could speak to, I guess, in relation to, I think, these other questions, how Arabian culture's approach to technology and fantasy affects the writing, and what you would expect to see coming from the younger generation who experience the culture differently from a Western culture, for example, like fantasy and jinns and ifrits and all that.
So I think every culture has its own folklore and its own kind of collage of words and of mythical creatures and of mythical beings. And interestingly enough, it's that a lot of these kind of myths don't only exist in the far past. Like in Saudi Arabia, we have a sort of new myth called the Namnam, which is not pretty old. It's like 150 years old. Okay, which and where they believe that there are these certain humans that live amongst us, and that they go hunting other people at night and eating children, and they use this to terrify their kids not to go out at night. And we're exploring writing a novel or maybe a movie about that kind of. But again, how that creature behaves and what it does is totally different than what the West would think of vampires or werewolves.
It sounds
it's a
kind of like
different.
Krampus. It sounds almost like the Germanic creature Krampus.
Yeah.
And one of the things that are related to environment, and going back to that, we were talking about the sacred, like we have problems with water, and in the future what's going to happen with the overpopulation, and one of the things that we were thinking about the GMOs, and that's that's some of the artists, they said that it's the solution for the overpopulation. But when is this going to end? To what limit we are going there? Because remember, as a physician, I'm worried about the health consequences of this. And this is something that we want to explore as writers. Are we getting too obsessed with that? Is that technology is actually for our favor, or it's actually something that will be the next thing?
So on that note, in our part of the world, there's a lot of investment right now in research in developing through GMOs plants that grow in the desert, that can use seawater to grow rather than fresh water. And so there's a lot of things because of the environment we're living in that is going to influence how technology works and how we look at this technological impact.
I have heard that much less material is translated into Arabic than any other major language. Would you comment a little bit on translation of outside writing in and out of Arabic?
So again, because most publishers thought that there is no money in fiction, So they never invested in local fiction, let alone translation. Yes. But now with, like we've had a lot of translation for all the blockbuster movies. So all the blockbusters are being translated, whether they're fiction or not. But then the lesser known novels and series, although they might be very successful where they originated, but are not really being translated. And that's one of the things we're trying to figure out in my company as well, is the two-way translation. Like how can we expose the world more to our science fiction, and how can we expose the local communities to less known fiction? Because all the blockbusters, whether they're being translated as novels or also the movies and the TV shows, they're all subtitled. But that also doesn't give our local community the real view of what fiction and fantasy really looks like in the West or in the East. So that is definitely, again, right now changing, because now publishers realize that all the bestsellers are being fantasy and science fiction, be it as it may from local authors. They would start exploring, I would assume, bringing in other successful authors from around the world to be translated, or even translating less known works of some famous authors. Okay, so they have blockbusters, but their less known work are not being translated yet, and we're trying to start off with that.
And remember, publishers, at the end of the day, they are led by numbers. So now, after they're seeing the success of the fiction, actually, it's already begun. Okay, they are looking into more non-Arab kind of fiction, not only English, I would say. Even from Spanish culture, we have a lot of work that is being translated right now. And a lot of people who are actually getting more interested in being in the translation kind of business. So publishers only that do translated work. And remember, we had romance for a very long time. People are sick of romance. People are
Like most of our novels are either romance or social drama, more or less. Very few authors wrote anything. Like 10 years ago, you would rarely find anything outside these two. So it would either be romance or social drama, and that would be all the kind of novels that we have. But this is really changing and pretty fast, much faster than we anticipated.
And actually, you guys are being interested in our work. One of the writers, who maybe was one of the first writers who had like some kind of, I'm not sure if it's considered alternate history. His name is Ashraf Faqih. Basically, he wrote
Historical fiction.
Yeah, it's basically he writes Dracula from the Islamic perspective.
Because Dracula actually, the real character of Dracula actually was a result of an interaction between Europe and the Ottoman Empire. So, so he kind of wrote a historical fiction about the birth of this character during that era. You had a question.
When you develop those plants and the water technology, you can sell it to us and you're turning ourselves into it.
We're already looking into some of that in the Central Valley.
Yeah, really. For some reason, Amazon is not letting me buy Frankenstein in Baghdad, but they dropped the sample. You had me on the first page of your book, which I've also, this is all I've looked at, but I've downloaded a free copy. Just go on Amazon, this thing. You have me on the first page when you dated everything as the fall of El Andalus. So, and your stuff. Do I have any? Can I get it?
Yes. Yeah. My second novel it's ready on Amazon. It's you can download it for free.
In English?
No.
No, this
Okay,
time.
sorry.
I'm still working on
Okay,
it.
so I think they're giving us the stop
Stop time.
sign, so I'll be outside if any of you wants to.
I'll be more than happy
Is there a good way to get in touch with you guys?